Hello, I'm Chris. I'm the editor of MacFormat magazine, and this is Matt, who's the deputy editor of MacFormat. The iPad Air is out today in the US, the UK, China, and a bunch of other countries as well. And we were sitting in the office having a chat about it, and we thought, screw it, let's video this chat in case you find it useful and interesting too. Now, the reason we're talking particularly today is that with the iPad Air being out today, I've been using an iPad mini since it came out, since its launch, and Matt has been using an iPad 4 since its launch. So we're both coming at this, which is kind of halfway between both of them in a sense.
They match up together.
So we thought we'd have a bit of a chat basically about what this device represents to each of us. Why don't you start with the weight of the iPad Air?
Yeah, so for me the thing is, when the weight went up with after the iPad 2 for the iPad 3, and it was the performance trade-off. You needed the extra battery life to make the
power of the Retina display.
To get the Retina display up and running properly. And even in the iPad 3, they didn't even get the balance perfect. It wasn't until the iPad 4 that we really got something that actually worked as fast as the iPad 2 did. Even though the processor was more powerful, the fact is that it was just doing so much more work. So the balance just went off. The iPad 2 was in some ways the best of the iPads up until now because it was lighter, it was faster. You had to put up with the lower res screen, but it was just so nice.
But I mean, when the iPad 3 came out, you and I talked, and what I wanted was an iPad 2 with a Retina screen in it, basically, because that form factor was just about right. The size was nice, the weight was okay, but after seeing the Retina display, you couldn't go back. And yet, what we've got here with the iPad Air is precisely that, and it's actually lighter than the iPad 2 was
by 130 grams or something.
Thereabouts.
Like a good chunk.
It's not a small amount. However, the first time we picked up the 5th gen iPod Touch, and I kept saying it is preposterously light.
It's like 80 grams or something, isn't it?
But screw the figures. These figures don't matter. When you hold this, as you've said, it feels too light.
Yeah.
And as much, not in the sense that you think it should be heavier, but you look at it and you expect a certain ergonomics, a certain physicality to it when you pick it up, and it confounds your expectations every time.
Yeah, and what I was saying this morning was, that's not really the case with the iPad Air. I was expecting it to be. I was expecting to pick it up and it'd be like the iPod Touch, and I would just be amazed. But it doesn't. It's not astonishing in its lightness, even though it's a huge chunk lighter than the iPad 4. What it feels like is the correct weight for its size, which is great because it's smaller, but I actually was expecting to be blown away by the lightness.
Yeah.
And I wasn't so much.
And
which isn't to say the lightness isn't
impressive.
a huge improvement.
Indeed. But that's an interesting thing for you to say, especially having used your iPad 4
from my chunky iPad
for so long, which is, and always has been, it's felt thick.
Yes.
I mean, we can appreciate technical excellence in putting it together, but it has felt thick and it is heavy. And if you're using it, if you're holding it for a long period of time, whether you're reading, browsing, or playing games as you do a lot, you definitely notice that.
Yeah.
This, though, definitely feels lighter, but as you say, it's not the kind of astonishing thing that you might have expected.
The difference is, you can feel it just in your two hands, the difference, but it's not like I'm going to chuck this one across the room and with one throw a frisbee across. It's just, it's lighter, it doesn't, I'm not as blown away by the lightness difference as I thought I would be, but I fully expect that after using the iPad Air for even just a week, if I then pick up the iPad 4, it will feel unbelievably heavy.
Yeah, it'll feel old-fashioned.
It's only this first year I'm kind of going, oh well, I thought it would just feel like an empty shell.
But it was interesting because when the iPad mini came out and we got ours and we were playing with it in the office, everyone who got it did the same sort of thing. They sort of picked it up and went, oh, and then they were sort of, you really engage with the physicality of this object because it feels very, very different. And while it doesn't have the same sort of wow factor in terms of lightness that the iPod Touch has, it is definitely a very svelte, neat feeling little thing.
I've had a thing like in my mind that it's a completely bizarre thing to do, or to even think is important, but ever since the MacBook Air really came out, and you could pick it up between your thumb and finger and wave it around. That's been like a little thing that sits in my mind. If you can do that with a good sized gadget, that's impressively light. And you can do it with this.
And that suggests a certain humanness in a certain human centricity.
You can just about do it with this, but that's not like, I'm going to drop this.
Yeah. and you know, your thumb is white as you're
exactly
gripping that.
This is in the middle, you can do it just about with this, but like, it's such a silly little thing, because when is it important? When does it ever really happen? But it's just such a good sign of something that is light, that is super light for its size.
The thing that I find interesting in the Mac with the iPad Air is I think I'm going to buy one of these, and the reason is I've been using the iPad Mini for many months, and it is as wonderful a little gadget now as it was then, and it is a stunning little bit of design. It's a terrific little thing, and it feels, because it's the same size as my second generation Kindle, same weight pretty much as well, it feels like a really toteable, fun little thing. But I find it for the sort of stuff that I'm doing, it just isn't, it doesn't give it, I can't produce as much on it, which is not to raise the spectre of the old iPads are for consumption canard, but I can't get as much done in this as I want to.
Well, we do a lot of writing, which not everyone does.
Indeed.
I mean, people do emails and stuff like that, but
we're bashing out thousands of words a day.
Yeah, I have replaced my laptop with an iPad for a few years now. When my MacBook died, basically, a couple of years ago, and I got an iMac, and my iPad is my only portable computer, and it's fine because most of the work I do portable is writing, and on the trains to London, stuff like that, an hour and a half, got the Logitech Ultra thing, keyboard, so a good sized keyboard. That just doesn't translate to the iPad Mini.
It doesn't.
So for us at least, we can't talk.
Indeed.
Probably if you're doing some GarageBand stuff, then the iPad Mini would be okay.
But there are definitely parallels you can draw. If you're doing creative stuff like drawing or painting, the larger canvas of this gives you a bit more breathing space, but then again, the Mini is still more portable, it's more toteable.
It's interesting that a lot of the time when we've been talking about canvas size or workspace, and it's been in relation to Macs or laptops or whatever, we are just talking about resolution. Because the higher the resolution in a given screen space, the way things scale, the more space you have to work in, things just look a bit smaller. Now we're talking about set resolutions. Even the iPad Mini Retina will have the same resolution as the big iPad. So the space to work in is literally just the space to work in, the inches of the thing. It's kind of a different way of thinking of it.
Here's one thing I wanted to talk to you about, because you know lots of good stuff about chip design, which is quite an esoteric subject, and it's not the Apple way. We don't talk about specs with Apple stuff for good reason, and I think Apple has made the right decision to talk about the experience and to design for the experience rather than designing for a product matrix. But it is notable that normally we see a more powerful processor powering the iPad, so we'd expected the A7X rather than the A7 processor that it has this time round. So why not the A7X?
Good question. Yeah. There is Apple doesn't make its own GPUs yet. I think it's bought a GPU design company. It makes its own processors, but it doesn't make its own graphics chips. So it has to buy in. There is actually a chip on the market that's more powerful than the one in the iPhone 5S. But from the same manufacturer, just the next level up. But it's chosen not to use it. Who's to say why? Power consumption may be massive, disproportionately higher.
And it could be thermal envelope stuff.
Which basically, there is better thermal envelope in the iPad Air compared to the 5S anyway, which we know from Anantech's testing that they've done, which is that even though the iPad Air and the 5S have essentially the same chip, the iPad Air gets better performance because it can get hotter. Yeah. It can run hotter for longer.
Because there's more space to dissipate the heat.
Exactly. So it's just the difference between it being in a small enclosure and it being in a large enclosure. But I suppose one reason not to bother is just how many you can make. Making two kinds of chips means you need two production lines, or one production line that only works half the size. And Apple is releasing updates to all of its products at once, almost. So there's lots of stuff that needs a new A7 chip. So it is just, if it only makes one kind of chip, then it's much easier for it to reach demand, to sell more, and the crucial thing is the A7 is more powerful than the A6X.
The other thing that's worth noting as well is that the A7 processor is the first 64-bit processor, and it's possible that Apple's just giving itself a little bit of time, and giving developers and the OS team and everyone else a little bit of time just to make sure it's walk before you can run stuff, basically, before we wrap everything else up as well. Let's just change one part of this at a time.
Yeah, the A5X needed, the only difference between it and the A5 was the graphics processor to do the Retina screen, but it wasn't good enough. So the A6X needed an even more powerful one, even compared to what was in the iPhone 5. Now they don't need to be different. They can make one chip that works well in both with just a few tweaks for power efficiency, and that's it, job done. So why not make one?
Indeed. Talking about the guts, actually, one thing that you picked up on this morning when the first time you held this is that the weight is actually slightly unevenly distributed, for good reason.
Yes, it's definitely heavier at the bottom than the top. That's really obvious if you just turn it one way or the other. You can feel that it pull, you know, when I hold it like this, I can feel the weight on my palm.
Yes.
When I hold it like this, I can feel the weight on my fingers.
Pushing down that way, yeah.
Which I think Apple talked about.
Yeah, they talked about the fact that they'd engineered the balance of this very carefully, and apparently that's what they were referring to. Now we're not going to tear this one apart, but we're going to wait and see what iFixit does. Because traditionally on an iPad, what you found was you had the logic board running down one side of it, and then you had a big battery basically taking up most of it. And it wouldn't surprise us if this time round Apple's basically switched it around so that you've got the battery running along here, and then the circuit board running along the top of that.
Definitely seems like an obvious way to change.
It would make sense.
The distribution, but it is like, and it's just a small thing that helps it not feel as heavy in your hands for a long time, because the weight is sitting on the strongest part instead of on your fingers.
Yeah. The last thing I wanted to talk about actually was the I guess the thinness of this, and the fact that it feels like such a the front and the back the lines of it seem so parallel. It feels, because with that, with your 4, there's quite a swoop in on the edge, and that was a kind of a trick to make it seem thinner than it is. With this, it does feel like this little single plane of material that's holding it. It feels like a very square little solid thing, which I quite like.
It's funny, yeah, but again, it's funny because it's a bit like the weight thing, where you're not as blown away, or I wasn't as blown away by the weight as maybe expected. I wasn't blown away by the thinness either, but I think the reason for that is exactly this trickery. When I hold this in my hand, I can feel this thin edge against my hand, and then the actual thickness in the middle is kind of immaterial to me, whereas here, I can just feel the thickness the entire way. So the trickery means that the thinness of this, again, you can notice it. It's obvious once you are thinking about it, but it's just surprising it's not as pronounced as you might think.
Actually, I said it was the last thing. The last thing I want to talk about is the one apparent big omission from this generation.
Yes.
Which is the Touch ID sensor.
Yes.
Now, conspiracy theorists would tell you this is Apple building in a reason for you to buy the next one, if you buy this one, and there may be something to that. There may be reasons of supply, which is why Apple hasn't put Touch ID sensor in here. But it is a thing that makes you stop and think. Because I was going to go out and buy one of these today, and then you go, because as soon as you've used the iPhone 5S, and you go back to a device that doesn't have a Touch ID sensor on it, you have a moment of cognitive dissonance. You sit there for a minute and go, oh, of course I've got to put my password.
So I think just having this little square on the home button looks old-fashioned.
It does, doesn't it?
I think if we ditch the conspiracy theories and do a bit of Occam's razoring, if I had to suggest a reason why Apple wouldn't have included it, it would be that the iPhone is an individual personal device. The iPad is often shared among families. I'm sure Apple would love for everyone to have one each, but it just doesn't happen. And my thinking is that the way the Touch ID software at least is set up at the moment, you can record five individual fingerprints. So that's okay for one person. You're not, no one uses their fourth finger to unlock their phone.
But the implication was at the time even that you could add other people's.
You could.
So that's the thing. So with my iPhone, for example, I've got my thumb, both my thumbs, both my index fingers, and then my wife's right thumb registered as well, so she can use my phone as well.
So that you've got convenience for you, and then she can get in on the action. But when that doesn't scale up to a family in the iPad, because
to a school.
Well, certainly
or
to a
to
school.
A business.
I mean, there's the options of just using the using the passcode.
Or not having a passcode at all.
Yeah, but I don't know if you can do that anymore. I think you have to have a passcode.
What do you?
So if it's a Touch ID thing, definitely. But I think it doesn't scale up, and I think we've chatted loads before about what Apple could do with Touch ID for cheating and making the iPad a multi-user device. Like if your kid logs in with their fingerprint, it cuts off all apps that are age 15 and over or 11 and over and locks out IAPs. Whereas if you log in, everything is unlocked. And it's not about having different accounts like you would on a Mac. It's about just locking things out of the one account.
Indeed.
I'd suggest that stuff isn't ready. Touch ID, they haven't got it ready to scale up yet, and so they just aren't sure how best to implement it on a device like the iPad that is more shared.
Which would make sense for an iOS 8 launch alongside
they've got
a new iPad.
They've got a year to work on it now,
Yeah.
so I'm sure in the next one we might see it solved. But my purely speculative theory is that it's just for a different kind of device. It's not ready.
So let's do a wrap up of purchase intentions then. I would go out and buy this today if I had Touch ID.
Yeah.
I might still buy it without it. I just can't decide. I would like, because I keep my devices for a long time, I'd like to have an A7X processor in there so that there is more graphical punch so that it will last a bit longer with advanced apps and games that come out. But I don't really care that much. And going from a Mini to an iPad Air will give me tons and tons and tons more productivity. I'll get so much more done on this. So I'm edging towards buying it. What about you?
I've no interest in the Minis, even in the Retina Mini, which we haven't seen.
And won't see until the end of November.
No, because it's just not going to work for me. The writing, the stuff I do on the go, and all the video I watch on it. I just want the bigger screen, but I want the lightness. So this is perfect for me. And it's the same thing with the Touch ID. It makes me hesitate, but I think for all the extra usefulness. I mean, I have an iPad 4, so I don't necessarily need.
That's the thing.
I don't need to change in terms of power or utility, but I carry it everywhere with me, and I will over time. I'm certain that I will appreciate shaving off that weight.
You might find your usage for it changes as well, because you might start using it around the house in different ways. Whereas you might not have taken it from room to room, or you might have reached for your iPhone to do something because the 4 was a bit too heavy just to pick up from beside you on the sofa, which sounds like the worst of first world problems, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You might find yourself maybe changing a little bit if you use it. But I think for you, the reason to go for this is less powerful. There's less benefit to you from switching from a 4 to an Air than from me switching from a Mini to the Air.
Yeah. Especially as you get to go from a kind of weird mid-retina
Yes.
in the Mini to a full retina. But also, and this ends up factoring into purchase decision. It's not about the devices, but I can sell my 4 for a pretty good amount of money. It's really going to have retained its value.
Yeah.
So I can make up a chunk of this money quite easily.
Terrific. All right, we are obviously going to spend more time with these than just. I enjoyed this chat. I don't know if you did, but we're obviously going to spend much more time with the iPad Air before we even think about putting a review together. But that was just a quick hands-on. The next issue of MacFormat will be out at the beginning of December, I think. Although a small amount of text will now show up at the bottom of the screen here, correcting me if I'm wrong. And we will have a full review in there. If you get any questions, get in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, app.net, or indeed Google+, and we'll try to answer them as best we can.